the
All right,
Okay,
so
I
this
started the
is
recording.
case study 2.2, the battle over vaccinations for EDAD 7302 class, professional ethics and values, with Mr. Connolly Fuller, Tonia Turner, Sarah Tipton, Pansy Cornett, and myself, Bianca Villareal. So to get us started, we are going to go ahead and go to the next slide. Um, And this is just a case overview over mandatory immunization requirements. So a little bit of history about this case before we go into the ethical discussion regarding it. It is about vaccinations, which were back in time called inoculations, pre-big pharma and autism fears. They started in the 10th century in China and later Africa. This was actually a pivotal survival practice during the American Revolution, specifically in Valley Forge, where slaves actually taught other soldiers how to conduct inoculations while they were trying to battle smallpox, and it ended up saving a lot of lives and probably several battles after Valley Forge. Um, and then there was a British study linking the practice to autism. This was done by Wakefield in 1998. This study was eventually debunked, and there were some fraudulent practices done during that study where they found that the data was manipulated. But because the study had already been published and put out into the world, the damage had already been done. It caused a lot of fear in parents, especially because the study claimed that there was a link between vaccinations and autism in children. So, post Big Pharma and autism fears, um, there were several things that happened because there were still vaccinations being done. It was eliminated by the year 2000. Medical experts came out and said that this was no longer a problem. However, after non-vaccination movements and the fear that Wakefield study had put out, it reemerged in 2014 because children in various states in the US were no longer being vaccinated due to parental choice or religious reasons, and so on and so forth. There was another outbreak just recently in 2024 last year, for somewhat the same reasons, which is what we're going to discuss very soon here. As far as the government action that has been taken with this case, according to disease experts, there is a 95% rule that says that 95% of the public has to be vaccinated in order to initiate herd immunity, meaning that this is not a problem and an outbreak would not happen. But right now, in states, especially like California, we have like 30 to 40% of communities that are not vaccinated, and they see problems specifically in those states. California and Mississippi have responded to some of these outbreaks, and they passed laws banning vaccination exemptions, whether it were for religious or medical reasons. Oregon and Washington tried to follow, but that failed to pass. And the reason is there's been a lot of controversial discussion over this, is because there are ethical concerns, whether it be for religious purposes or parental choice. There are a lot of questions that come to play, such as, are unvaccinated children really putting the public at risk? Are children suffering a preventable and painful disease? Is this something that parents are choosing to put their children through when it can be prevented? And also, what is considered a qualified religious or medical exemption, and who is making these decisions? So it's always the question of according to who, which is something that we're fixing to discuss in and out within the following slides. And we'll go ahead and move on to Connolly.
Thank you, Bianca. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So here we're going to give a quick ethical review of face value, and also if we review a few identified ethical dilemmas that we identified. So just at a quick glance, Chapter 6 underscores ethical decision making and is complex and vulnerable to fail, to failure as well. So even good people can do things wrong if they go about doing things like not recognizing ethical issues, not rationalizing their decisions, having lack of motivation and courage. So leaders have a duty to cultivate awareness, judgment, and resolve so they can cast light instead of shadow. And we're also going to talk about these three identified ethical dilemmas: the individual rights versus public health, freedom of belief versus scientific consensus, and trust and credibility. Next slide, please. So we're going to unpack a few of those, right? So with those three, with that first one, individual rights versus public health. This is a dilemma because enforcing vaccination limits personal freedom while not enforcing it risks public harm. So in Jacobson versus Massachusetts, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the state's authority to require a smallpox vaccination, recognizing that personal liberty can be restricted to protect public health. So number two, the freedom of belief versus scientific consensus. So this is the dilemma because respecting beliefs may undermine public safety and violate professional standards. In Prince versus Massachusetts, the Supreme Court held that religious freedom does not include liberty to expose the community or a child to a communicable disease. In the final dilemma, trusting credibility. So this is a dilemma because acting decisively may protect people, but be seen as paternalistic, and overemphasis on consensus can delay critical health measures. And Johnson writes, and he highlights that the importance of moral legitimacy and warns that using power coercively can damage trust. So in chapter 2, it says, when followers perceive leaders as overstepping their authority or dismissing their concerns, the result is often a loss of credibility and erosion of moral authority, page 61. So next we're going to go into our method that we chose, and that is Nash's 12 questions.
All right. Oops, sorry. I'm on. Okay. Okay. So Nash's 12 is a method where you basically start from these 12 questions. It helps decision makers avoid bias. And the reason, well, I think, first of all, if you're going to avoid bias, I think everybody who comes to the decision-making table has to really be committed to being unbiased and really looking critically and objectively at the data that is presented. So here are some of the questions. Have you defined the problem accurately? How would you define the problem from the other side's perspective, which I think is an interesting question that maybe that could be, if we used that one a little more often and used it authentically and truthfully, then we, just in general for at this time in our really divided country that we might get a little further. Another one that I think is really good is how does this intention compare with likely outcomes? Like, first of all, it's really hard to predict the future, and no matter how much data we're bringing to the table, it's never completely complete. So I would just say that this is a really good starting point for decision making, but because, people are involved, it's, there's a lot more that goes into it. So how it might help with the immunization decision, questions 1 through 3 sort of define the problem, like get as much of that information out as possible. Questions 7 and 8 really address all the stakeholders, like who's involved, who needs to be at this table making these decisions. Questions 5 and 6 and 9, they address sort of the goals. And so in this case, maybe the goal might be herd immunity, or it might be building back trust in the government. So like you have to decide on those quandaries. Questions 10 and 11, they really reflect on whether the decision can be openly justified to the public. So you've got to make a decision that you can communicate to the public and they're going to receive as valid. And then the last is talking about those possible exemptions, whether they be, religious or just, as Tonia was saying earlier before we started our discussion, like conscientious objectors for whatever reason. I was going to add too that there are some really good, useful, and positive aspects of this method of problem solving or decision making, and they do pose like a few weaknesses as well. So one of the best, as I was saying before, is that if you really come to the table honestly and you're willing to look at all different sides, this can be it encourages transparency and it sort of encourages empathy as well. And really, if you're looking for long-term solutions, this is a great method. Some disadvantages might be that it's very time intensive. It takes a lot of people and a lot of research. And also it takes a lot of self-control for the people at the decision-making table. But all in all, no matter what, it's a great place to start when you really need to make decisions based on the weight of data and research. So that's all I've got for that.
Great. I'm going to talk about the discussion probe that was in our textbook. This was a question that asked if you were a state legislator, would you support a bill to strengthen mandatory immunization requirements by eliminating personal belief exemptions? Why or why not? So I looked at the breakdown that Pansy did of how each part of the Nash's 12 kind of addresses different aspects, and I came up with kind of a game plan. Like if I was on a committee with some other lawmakers down in Austin and we were trying to put this bill together, we'd probably need to have some public hearings and hear testimony from the public, and then we would also want some expert input on the issue. And we would really have to determine, what is the goal of this bill? Are we just trying to tell people what to do? Or is the role of government for the betterment of society as a whole? We're trying to strengthen public health. And going back to some of the Supreme Court cases that Connolly mentioned, do we have the freedom to put others at risk? Is that something that we are just going to be fine with if people say, well, I don't want to get vaccinated. I don't mind if my kids get chicken pox. They'll be immune from it from then on out. So with those different considerations, knowing that my background is in education, I have some bias as to whether or not we should strengthen these requirements because it affects school enrollment, it affects people who work in schools. So with all that in mind, I came up with some potential solutions that might be beneficial for all of the different parties concerned. I would allow for very few medical exemptions. This would be my recommendation. Only if a doctor can verify a chronic or life-threatening illness. So if you have a medical exemption, it has to be verified by a doctor. And then give people some options. A lot of the fear that Bianca talked about, with fear of autism or other problems or fear of too many vaccines, I thought about a possibility of minimizing the number of required vaccines and allowing children to be vaccinated at later ages rather than so many when they're so young. I think that's where a lot of the fear comes from. And so we tried to kind of bring all of this together in a way that would give people some agency, but also do what's best for society as a whole.
All right, so I'm just going to summarize what we've talked about. Basically, from historical background, we've understood that there was a reason why we mandated vaccines. And so back in those days, it was required because it had become a pandemic. However, today we're much more advanced, and so mandating vaccinations is probably not the best ethical decision. And what I'm hearing from our group is that we probably can just come up with some decisions where we strengthen the bill, not necessarily mandate that everybody be vaccinated, and maybe even give, as Sarah was saying, give some autonomy and some give the people back some say in whether or not they're going to go forward with vaccination